Hello, we are from Group 3. Here we are going to explain the function of language. Definition of language functions. Viewed from the language aspect as a means of communication can be distinguished two types of language functions, namely structural function and pragmatic function. These two functions are related because every structural function is related to a pragmatic function. The flow is known by the name of functionalism. This argues that the elements of languages that make up the language system, such as phonological and grammatical elements and semantics, are determined by the function of language in society. Around the end of the 1920s, Europe developed its previous stream started in the field of phonology, with figures such as Matthias, Trubetskoy, and Jacobson. They emphasize the function of the distinguishing element in language structure. In English, the phoneme p and the phoneme p are two different phonemes, because p and p represent contrasting meanings, say pin and pin have different meanings. Now, let us talk about the structural function of language. It is a network between language elements at a small level with elements language at a greater level in language analysis. The structural function is related to the function of the language elements in the system, while the function pragmatic is related to the use of language in communication. Karl Popper is a psychologist and linguist originating from Germany, argues that the basic function of language is as a means of communication between speakers and speakers about something. This concept is usually called the organon model of language. According to Karl Popper, there are three types of language functions, namely representative functions, expressive functions, and functions cognitive. First, the representative function is the correlation between language symbols and things it represents. In other words, it is describing something. Then, expressive function is a correlation between the symbols of the language and the speaker. The language is used to reveal things related to the speaker. Last, function cognitive is the correlation between language symbols and listeners, which aims to make the listeners do something. Now let us talk a little about the originator of this language functions idea. Roman Osipovich Jacobson was born on October 11, 1896. He was a linguist and literary theorist. As a structuralist linguist, he was quite influential in the first half of the 20th century. His broad interest in fields other than linguistics had an impact on semantics, semiotics, poetry, music, visual arts, and cinema. Reading his theories, we will inevitably run into big names like Saussure with his idea of structuralism in linguistics, Peirce in semiotics, Popper, Lévi-Strauss, Borges, Hymes, Boas, Worth, and Bloomfield. For a moment, here are his talks in his paper entitled On Linguistic Aspects of Translation, which he wrote in 1959. His theory about translation can be seen from his talks about the field of study in translation. According to him, the meaning lies in the marker or the signer, and not in the marker, the signified. First of all, he based his ideas on the Saussure idea of markers and markers. A marker is a name or word, and the marker is an object or concept that the marker refers to. However, the relationship between this marker and marker like arbitrary. The word tree as a marker, for example, represents a tree object in the real world. Furthermore, he argues there are three types of translation. They are intralingual translation, interlingual translation, and intersemiotic translation. Intralingual translation means rewriting the meaning of one text in one language into another text in the same language. This intralingual translation can be in the form of rewriting the text with different words, paraphrasing, summarizing, or making other forms of expression of the meaning or message in the same language. Then, the interlingual translation is the rewriting of the meaning of a text in one language into another text in a different language. This is what we generally call translation today. Meanwhile, intersemiotic translation is the expression of the meaning of a written text in a language into a different system of signs, meanings, or forms. What can be included in this process is the reopening of a novel into a film. From Jacobson's idea about these three types of translation, it is his ideas regarding equivalence in interlingual translation that place him in the ranks of translation theorists from among structural literacy circles. Roman Osipovich Jacobson was a founding linguist of the school Prague, expanded on Karl Bühler's concept of language function, and he argues there are 6 factors of speech that affect language function, namely, context means the code text, that is, the other verbal signs in the same message, and the word in which the message takes place. Then there is an addresser, means a sender or enunciator. An addressee means a receiver or enunciate, a contact between the addresser and the addressee. Next is a common code, and the last one is a message. So the flow is the addresser or sender sends message to the receiver or the addressee, so that the message must be conveyed in a context. The message is conveyed in a code form or symbol of which used to describe a certain meaning, partially or entirely known by sender and receiver. Furthermore, channels of communication and psychological relationship between sender and receiver allow communication between the two. Next, based on the 6 factors of speech that Jacobson has mentioned, distinguish 6 language functions, namely referential function, emotive function, poetic function, function fatigue, cognitive function, and metalingual function. Referential function is related to the meaning of the message conveyed in specific context. The emotive function is closely related to the inner mood speakers of the message conveyed. The poetic function of language is the aesthetic of language, which allows the creation of message. Fatigue function aims to maintain communication between speakers and speakers. The cognitive function aims to cause a reaction to the listener. And last, the metalingual function is the language used as a metalingual to describe related matters with the language, such as definition and explanation of the meaning of the word. First, referential function. Jacobson says that among the 6 functions of language, the foremost is referential function. Language is a verbal means for conveying a message. A referential function is a function where a sentence is conveyed in a specific context so that there is no duality in interpreting the sentence. So, for example, you say, our business hours are 9 a.m. till 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. In the example above, the message conveyed contains information on the days and hours for business services in an office. This is what is meant by conveys what context you want to convey by providing the required information. But if you only say our business hours are 9 a.m. till 5 p.m., the listeners will ask, are they open every day or not? Then there will be miscommunication at that time because of the lack of information provided in the message. Correspondingly, quoted from Tribus 2017, Jacobson called the referential function the leading task of numerous messages and said that the accessory participation of all other functions in such messages must be taken into account by the observant linguist. The leading task of numerous means that the main thing in communication is the conveying of the message to be conveyed clearly. Now let's move to the other function, the emotive function. The emotive function is closely related to the inner mood speakers of the message conveyed. In emotional utterances, the addresser seeks to create the impression of a certain emotion, either real or feigned. The emotive element of speech can be described with a finite number of categories and so remain vague, protean, fluctuating phenomena which refuses to tolerate our science. Emotive elements can be categorized because people have different ways of expressing their moods in the messages they want to convey. For example, when you say, "Yeah, it's pretty," the sentence can cause two emotions depending on how you express the sentence and how the tone of voice you use. If you use a cheerful tone, the emotion expressed could be something that refers to praise. However, it will be different if the sentence is expressed in a sharp tone or a lazy tone, because the sentence with a sharp tone of voice usually expresses something you don't like, isn't it? Now let us see the difference. "Yeah, it's pretty," and "Yeah, it's pretty." The difference is obvious. Either say it honestly or pretend, it is still part of the emotive function. This was also conveyed by Tribes in 2017 in her journal. For students to become successful social agents, they must be attuned not only to what others are saying, but to the emotional and physical aspects of each interaction as well. Also, according to Atkinson in Tribes 2017, by adapting to others' tone, body language, and perceived intentions, individuals have a higher likelihood of participating in effective turn-taking, understanding, and appropriate response, increasing the overall quality of communication. Third is the poetic functions. The poetic function of language is the aesthetic of language, which allows the creation of messages. According to Tribes 2017, the complexity of sound and nuance and the balance make it an auditory or poetic work. The poetic function is usually associated with prose and poetry, which aims to show the beauty of language to entertain the readers. However, the other functions need not be absent in poetic texts. They merely play a subordinate role, just as in other linguistic genres. The poetic function is not absent but only appears in a subordinate role, such as in political slogans, advertising, commemorative speeches, and etc. So the poetic function is not only found in poetry and prose, but also in slogans or advertisements that we can encounter every day. They embellish the sentence to attract the attention of the reader. There are another manifestation of poetic purpose is the formulaic language, which can include chunks, collocations, situationally bound preferred formulas, and frames. Formulaic language falls within the realm of poetic function, and for some reason only the sound of balance has made these expressions preferred. Let's move to photic function. Photic function aims to maintain communication between speakers and speakers. According to Lanigan in Canada 2020, photic function is focused on physical and psychological engagement. This function is establishing, prolonging, checking, or discontinuing the linguistic messages in communication. The photic function also distinguishes first and second person discourse functions. The photic function is also usually used in small talk or daily conversation. That purpose can be verification, interest, or just greeting one another. Something that is used in daily talk or small talk between speaker and receiver. For example, when you say, "Hello," the word is used to greet, which the recipient will reply so that there is an interaction between you as the speaker and the receiver. And this has an effect on the course of communication. Another example is when you say, "Really? No way!" Whereas, this sentence is used to verify something, and that sentence is very often used in daily conversation. And probably, use this a lot when you are gossiping with your friends, right? Okay, now let us discuss about the conative function. The conative function aims to cause a reaction to the speaker. According to Tribes 2017, the conative function is a function of language that is focused on and concerned with influencing the behavior of the addressee and thus concerned with persuasion. The conative function is a function used to influence a person with speech to perform an action that the speaker or sender says. For example, you say, "Come here," to your friends. The phrase is used to call your friend to come to you, so that your friend, who is the person who received the message who get the conative functions, will do an act to come closer to you. So, this function is influencing behavior, or in other words, through this function, the speaker is trying to get someone as the receiver to do something related to his or her utterances. In this conative function, we just take a look at the speaker's utterance. If it indicates the addressee to do something, then we call it as conative function. Then the last is metalingual function. The metalingual function is a language used as a metalingual to describe related matters with a language, such as definition and explanation of the meaning of the word. According to Ursea and Murni 2014, the role of metalinguistic means comments on the language itself. This purpose is to speak or explain yourself using the language. The code itself is oriented, explained, or negotiated. This is the language feature of the language. And according to Drive 2017, it can be used to speak about semantic or grammatical constructs, to provide students with tools to track their learning, and to explain misconceptions. So, a metalingual function is a function that describes the language itself, which aims to explain further or also verify the definition or meaning of a word or phrase. For example, you hear someone says, "What do you mean by cruel?" This example asks to clarify the meaning of the word cruel. Another example is when you hear your friend says, "Water is a noun count noun, right?" Unlike the previous one who asked the meaning of the word cruel, the sentence "water is a noun count noun, right?" is intended to check the correctness of their knowledge of the word water, whether it enters into a noun count or not. That is what is meant by metalinguistic, a function used to describe the language itself. So, those are the explanation to the 6 language functions according to Jacobson. Now let's move to the relation between function. In Huber's article, he lists the relation between function. The first is the relation between the emotive and conative function, and the second one is the relation between the poetic and referential function. First is the correlation between the emotive and conative functions. The perfect address or message equivalence would have to be the spontaneous cry of pain. Even though the cry may be addressed to the receiver, it is associated almost consubstantially with the addresser, thereby leaving the conative function empty, so to speak. Conversely, an educational message is intended for the addressee, and generally entails an attenuation of the emotive function, when the emotive and conative functions are incompatible at any rate. The relation between emotive and conative will be explained in this case. Suppose you want to reach your friend, but the distance is very far. You will say, "Come here," so that your friend will move closer to you. The word "come here" has a conative function and cannot be used simultaneously with a sentence that has an emotive function, because if you unite the two in one sentence, the communication will not work. Something like this if you put the two together. You say, "Come here, Chloe. Your orchid is so pretty." Your friend Chloe, who heard this, will be confused, and finally, the communication will end in the word "thank you" only. Meanwhile, if both are not in the same sentence, it will sound like this. "Come here, Karen." Your friend Karen would reply, "Oh, hey Nancy, what's up?" Then, After that, you can only use a sentence that has an emotive function, such as, "Your artwork is so pretty." With that, the communication can be carried out. So when one of these functions dominates, the others are not needed, and vice versa. Last is the correlation between the poetic and referential function. Jacobson and Hubert say that ambiguity is an intrinsic inalienable character of any self-focused message, briefly a corollary feature of poetry. And the supremacy of poetic function over referential function does not obliterate the reference, but makes it ambiguous. The double-sense message finds correspondence in a split addresser, in a split addressee, and besides in a split reference, as it is congruently exposed in the preambles to fairy tales of various peoples. For instance, in the usual exordium of the Majorca storytellers, Axio era inoera, which means it was and it was not. So, this relation is called an inverse correlation. The more the message talks about itself and refers to itself, the less it talks about the context and refers to it, and vice versa. This may be related to literary works, where when a character in a literary work tells himself using a poetic function, the context to be conveyed will be further away. This is intended to create ambiguity in sentences, since the supremacy of poetic functions over referential function does not obliterate the reference but makes it ambiguous. Vice versa, the more someone talks about the context by including the information that should appear in the sentence, so what is being discussed will also be far from a poetic function which has ambiguity in the sentence. So that's all. Before we end this, we will conclude our explanation. The conclusion of our discussion this time is Roman Jacobson suggests 6 factors in speech, namely context, addresser, addressee, contact, code, and message. Then from these 6 factors, Roman Jacobson developed them into 6 functions of languages, namely referential function, emotive function, poetic function, photic function, connotative function, and metalingual function. Referential function is related to the meaning of the message conveyed in a specific context. The emotive function is closely related to the inner mood speakers of the message conveyed. The poetic function of language is the aesthetic of language, which allows the creation of message. Photic function aims to maintain communication between speakers and speakers. The connotative function aims to cause a reaction to the listener. The metalingual function is a language used as a metalingual to describe related matters with the language, such as a definition and explanation. Then there is a relationship between functions. These are the relation between the emotive and connotative functions, and the relation between the poetic and referential functions. Thank you.